What if I told you there was a man in medieval Europe who earned more than most merchants, was secretly visited by hundreds of patients as a healer, and yet wasn't allowed to drink from the same cup as his neighbors? What if I told you that the same hands that ended lives in the town square spent their afternoons setting broken bones and mixing herbal remedies? And what if the most feared man in the entire city was also responsible for cleaning its sewers? This man was the medieval executioner, and his daily life was nothing like you'd imagine. Today, we're going to walk through an entire day in the life of a medieval executioner, from the moment he wakes up to the moment he finally scrubs the last stain from his hands. And I promise you, almost none of it is what you'd expect. Chapter 1. Waking Up. Life on the Margins. It's roughly 5 in the morning. The executioner wakes in a house that sits apart from the rest of the town. This isn't by choice. In most of medieval Europe, executioners were required by law or custom to live outside the town walls, or at the very least on the outskirts. They were considered unehrlich in German-speaking lands, dishonorable, tainted. Their very touch was thought to carry a social stain, and this affected every part of their daily life. In many towns, an executioner could not drink from the same cup as other citizens. He could not sit in the same pew at church. His children were often barred from joining guilds or marrying into respectable families. If he walked into a tavern, other patrons might leave. But here's the twist. Despite being social outcasts, executioners were often surprisingly well paid. Many earned 2 to 4 times what a common laborer made. The city needed them, and the city compensated them. So you get this strange contradiction. A man who lives in a fine house filled with good food, whose neighbors refuse to acknowledge he exists. Our executioner rises, eats a breakfast of bread, cheese, and small beer, weak ale that everyone drank because the water couldn't be trusted, and begins preparing for the day ahead. Chapter 2. The Morning Routine. Tools and preparation. Executions didn't happen every day. In fact, a busy executioner might carry out only a dozen or so death sentences per year, but that didn't mean he sat idle. The executioner's morning was filled with preparation and maintenance. First, the tools. A dull axe was a professional embarrassment, and worse, a humanitarian disaster. A clean execution required a razor-sharp blade, a steady hand, and ideally, a single stroke. Botched executions were not just gruesome, they could turn a crowd against the executioner, and in some cases against the local authorities. There are historical accounts of executioners being attacked by mobs after a botched beheading. So sharpening, oiling, and inspecting every tool was a daily ritual. The executioner of a major city might maintain a full armory of instruments. Swords for beheading nobility, axes for commoners, ropes for hanging, branding irons, pincers for tearing flesh, and the wheel, that horrifying device used for breaking bones in public. But tools of death were only part of the kit. The executioner also maintained instruments of torture. In the medieval justice system, a torture was a legal method of extracting confessions, regulated by strict rules about how long it could last and what methods were permitted. The executioner was the one who carried it out, and he was expected to be skilled enough to cause the required amount of pain without accidentally killing the subject before trial. This is a good moment to mention something that surprises a lot of people. The executioner was often one of the most medically knowledgeable people in town. Through years of working with the human body, understanding where joints dislocated, which wounds were survivable, how bodies responded to trauma, many executioners developed a genuine expertise in anatomy. Some even ran side businesses as healers, bone setters, or folk doctors. We'll come back to this later. Chapter 3. Mid-morning. The walk through town. Around mid-morning, our executioner leaves his house and walks into town. Maybe he's been summoned to the jail to oversee a round of questioning. Maybe he's heading to the market square to inspect the scaffold ahead of tomorrow's scheduled punishment. Either way, his walk through town is an experience unlike anyone else's. People gave the executioner a wide berth. Not out of fear exactly, though that was certainly part of it, but because of a deep superstitious belief that his presence was contaminating. If an executioner touched a merchant's bread, that bread was considered unsellable. If he brushed against someone, they might demand compensation for the dishonor. In some towns, shopkeepers were legally required to serve the executioner, but they'd pass his purchases through a special window or leave them on the counter for him to collect, to avoid direct hand-to-hand contact. It's hard to overstate how isolating this was. Imagine being essential to the functioning of your entire society, the person who literally enforces the law's ultimate penalty, and yet being treated like you carry a plague. Executioners could not testify in court. In some jurisdictions, they couldn't even file complaints if they were assaulted, and yet people sought him out in private. This is where the executioner's dual life gets fascinating. On the street, he was untouchable, but behind closed doors, townspeople came to him for medical help, for remedies, even for magical cures. Human fat, blood, and body parts taken from executed criminals were believed to have healing properties. That the executioner controlled access to these materials, and he sold them, sometimes openly, sometimes discreetly. A vial of poor sinner's fat was a hot commodity in medieval folk medicine. Chapter 4. The execution itself. Let's say today is an execution day. This was a major public event. Think of it less like a modern legal proceeding and more like a piece of civic theater. The entire town showed up. Schools sometimes closed. Work paused. The execution was a spectacle, and it was designed to be. The procession began at the jail. The condemned prisoner was led through the streets, often accompanied by a priest offering last rites. The executioner walked behind or alongside, visible to all. In some traditions, the executioner would formally ask the condemned for forgiveness before carrying out the sentence. This wasn't just a nicety. It was a ritual designed to separate the personal from the professional. The executioner wasn't killing out of malice. He was an instrument of the court. The method of execution depended on the crime and the social class of the condemned. Beheading by sword was considered the most honorable death, and was typically reserved for nobility and high-ranking criminals. Commoners were usually hanged. Particularly heinous crimes, treason, heresy, counterfeiting, might warrant burning at the stake or breaking on the wheel. Each method demanded different skills. Beheading with a sword was considered the most difficult. The executioner had to sever the head in a single clean stroke. The condemned was usually kneeling, and the executioner swung horizontally. A good executioner could do this with terrifying precision. A bad one could take 3 or 4 strikes, which was a disaster for everyone involved. Hanging, though it looked simple, also required expertise. The executioner needed to judge the length of rope against the prisoner's weight. Too short, and the prisoner would slowly strangle, which could take 20 agonizing minutes. Too long, and the force could decapitate them, which horrified the crowd. The goal was a clean break of the neck. After the execution, the body had to be dealt with. In many cases, the executioner was responsible for disposal. Executed criminals were often denied a Christian burial. The executioner might bury the body in unconsecrated ground, or, in some cases, the body was left on display as a warning, hung in chains at a crossroads or mounted on a wheel outside the city gates. The executioner maintained these grim displays, replacing rotting remains as needed. And here's something the history books rarely mention: the emotional toll. Executioner Franz Schmidt of Nuremberg kept a diary throughout his career in the late 1500s, and in it you can trace a man who took his work seriously, who noted when he felt an execution was just or unjust, and who clearly struggled with the weight of what he did. He eventually petitioned the emperor to have his family's honor restored. It took years, but he succeeded. Chapter 5. The Afternoon. Other Duties. Here's something most people don't know. Execution was often just one part of the job description. Because the executioner was already considered dishonorable, many cities piled other undesirable tasks onto him. In quite a few German and Central European towns, the executioner was also responsible for maintaining public sanitation. That's right. The same man who wielded the axe in the morning might spend his afternoon clearing dead animals from the streets, managing the town's waste disposal, or supervising the cleaning of latrines and sewers. He might also be tasked with running lepers out of the city, overseeing the local brothel, or managing stray dogs. The logic was grimly practical. These were all jobs that respectable citizens refused to do. Since the executioner was already socially tainted, assigning him the town's dirty work cost the city nothing in terms of social capital. And since the executioner was well paid, he couldn't easily refuse. The afternoon might also include maintaining the instruments of punishment. Medieval justice wasn't limited to executions. Since there was a whole spectrum of corporal punishments that the executioner administered: flogging, branding, ear cropping, finger amputation, and public shaming in the pillory or stocks. Each of these required its own set of tools and its own set of skills. The executioner had to brand precisely enough to leave a recognizable mark without causing a fatal infection. He had to flog hard enough to satisfy the sentence without killing the prisoner. In cities with a jail, the executioner often served as a de facto warden, or at least a frequent visitor, responsible for persuading uncooperative prisoners to confess through legally sanctioned interrogation methods. That was not freelance cruelty. It was bureaucratic. The executioner followed detailed instructions from the court about what methods to use, how many times to apply them, how and when to stop. Chapter 6. Late Afternoon. The Healer's Secret. As the afternoon stretches on, the executioner's second career quietly begins. People start arriving at his door, always through the back, of course. A farmer with a dislocated shoulder, a woman with a persistent skin condition, a merchant's son with a broken bone that the town's barber surgeon couldn't set properly. The executioner's medical knowledge was self-taught, but remarkably practical. Through decades of working with the human body under extreme conditions, he had developed an intuitive understanding of anatomy that rivaled or exceeded what most formally trained physicians could offer. He knew which joints gave way under stress. He understood wound care in ways that only someone who routinely inflicted and observed wounds could. As he had access to cadavers and body parts that no other healer could legally obtain, many executioners compiled their own books of remedies, herbals, poultices, ointments. Some of these were genuinely effective. Others were pure superstition, rooted in the belief that materials from executed criminals had mystical healing powers. Human fat was rendered into salves. Skin was tanned into leather strips believed to cure ailments. Blood, collected fresh at executions, was sometimes sold to epileptics, who believed drinking it could cure their condition. This dual role, destroyer and healer, is one of the most fascinating contradictions of medieval life. The same hands that ended lives in the morning could set a bone in the afternoon, and mix a healing salve by evening, and the community, despite officially shunning the executioner, depended on him for this service. In many towns, He was the only affordable medical option for the poor. Chapter 7. Evening. Family, faith, and isolation. As evening falls, the executioner returns to the only world where he is fully accepted, his family. Executioners almost always married within their own social class. The daughter of an executioner married the son of another executioner, or perhaps a knacker, a gravedigger, or a tanner, someone from the other dishonorable trades. These families formed tight-knit networks that stretched across entire regions. A dynasty of executioners might serve a city for generations. Dinner in the executioner's household was probably not much different from dinner in any other reasonably prosperous home. Stew, bread, ale, perhaps some preserved meat or fish. And the children would be taught the trade from a young age, because they had virtually no other option. An executioner's son who tried to apprentice with a blacksmith or a baker would be turned away. The stain was hereditary. Faith was complicated. The executioner was almost always a Christian. The medieval world offered no real alternative, but his relationship with the church was strained. He could attend services, but was often seated separately. Some priests refused to give communion to executioners. Others insisted that the executioner's work, while necessary, placed his soul in constant peril. The executioner existed in a kind of spiritual gray zone, doing God's work according to the state, while being treated by God's representatives as something less than a full member of the community. And yet, many executioners were deeply devout. Franz Schmidt donated to churches and charitable causes throughout his career. He clearly believed that what he did served a purpose, and he sought meaning and absolution within the framework of his faith. Chapter 8. Night. Reflection and the weight of the work. As the candles burn low and the house grows quiet, we're left with the question that hangs over this entire story. What did it feel like? We can never fully know, but the few personal accounts we have suggest that executioners were not the unfeeling monsters of popular imagination. They were tradesmen doing a job that someone had to do, in a system they didn't design. Some clearly took pride in doing it well. A clean cut, a quick death, minimal suffering. Others seem to have been haunted by it. The executioner's life was defined by paradox. He was powerful but powerless, essential but despised, wealthy but unable to spend his money in the same taverns as his neighbors. He held the power of life and death, granted by the highest authorities in the land, and yet he couldn't get his daughter married to a carpenter's son. The medieval executioner forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about how societies work. Every civilization that has practiced capital punishment has needed someone to carry it out. And almost every one of those civilizations has simultaneously depended on and despised the person who does it. The executioner is the shadow that an orderly society casts, and he lived his entire life in that shadow. He was not a villain. He was not a hero. He was a man who woke up each morning, sharpened his tools, walked through a town that refused to meet his eyes, did what the law required, healed who he could, ate dinner with his family, and went to bed in a house that stood apart from all the others. And then he did it again the next day. If you found this video fascinating, make sure you hit subscribe and drop a comment telling me which part of the executioner's life surprised you most. Was it the healing, the sanitation work, the social isolation? Let me know. And if you want to go deeper, I'll leave some links in the description to some incredible historical sources, including Franz Schmidt's diary, which is an absolute must-read. Till next time.